My research project is on standardized testing, and this presentation is a summary of the information I think is relevant for a teacher in Tennessee. And in particular, at the end, I'm going to show some data on actual Tennessee students. So first I want to start with some definitions, and the first definition is, what is a standardized test? A standardized test is a test that would be given ideally to a lot of people over multiple administrations, where there's confidence that the content and the conditions for the test are equivalent over the multiple administrations. The idea there is the test itself is a level playing field because it's blind to who the test takers are, and in that way it makes it so that the scores that result are objective. Now there's a few terms that are relevant when we talk about standardized testing. The first one here is validity. Validity has to do with how well that test measures what it's supposed to. For example, if the ACT is supposed to be an indicator of how well a student does in college, then if a student has a high ACT score and then does well in college, that's evidence that the test is valid. Reliability has to do with how consistent that test is. If a student takes the test multiple times and doesn't change anything in between, a reliable test would give the same result. And the last two terms I have there have to do with stakes. So high stakes testing is a test that has consequences attached to the results, and those consequences can be either positive or negative. And low stakes testing has no consequences attached to the results. For example, diagnostic tests where you're just trying to get data about how well an ability, what types of ability are out there for something, would be a low stakes test. Now, this is a one slider on the standardized testing that's given in Tennessee, and it's quite an extensive list. You see the TCAP testing, basically students starting from third grade are taking tests every year. By the time they're in high school, they're taking end of curriculum tests for certain subjects. Also, all 11th graders are required to take the ACT, and Tennessee also participates in the NAEP, which is the Nation's Report Card. And then below that are some other optional tests, and also I included for completeness the test for becoming a teacher. So now I want to talk about the evolution of standardized testing, and I want to start with the year 1965. In 1965, there's the beginning of a push for educational reform. And the reason for that is there's two things happening at that time. The first thing is America has lost the space race. The Russians have beat us by sending Sputnik there. And we've, at this point, gotten to space, but we still haven't achieved the goal of going to the moon. And the second thing that's happening is the schools have recently been desegregated. And there's a big push by civil rights leaders to get equal access to quality education for everyone, including minorities. And so in 1965, there was this legislation, the ESEA, or the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which required state testing programs in exchange for Title I funding. For those who are familiar, Title I funding is the funding, it's known as the free lunch program, but it's the funding for public schools from the federal government for low socioeconomic status students. So there's this requirement. So this is kind of a big deal for standardized testing because now they're starting this requirement for state testing programs. But 50 years ago, it really the idea, what we know of standardized testing, was not really there yet. So what they saw as a result was the testing programs in different states varied significantly, and really what the states did was completely at their discretion. Because at that time, the prevalent standardized testing was this aptitude type testing, not achievement testing on specific subjects. And it was something that was used mostly as entrance exams at colleges and in the military. The types of standardized achievement testing we're talking about were available, but they were mostly used by individual teachers as diagnostic tests. And that was because the people that were creating them were the textbook publishers. So they were creating content and then offering these parallel tests for teachers. And the last thing that made it so the standardized testing was not that common at that time was that there really wasn't the technology. The scoring was still being done by hand, and the administration, the way that they were giving the test, had a lot of variability, and which in itself is kind of contradictory to the idea of a standardized test. So when we fast forward 20 years, this momentum for educational reform just kept growing. In 1983, this report was given for the nation at risk, and that was something that was it was a big deal because there was an economic crisis, and it was being blamed on by companies. The companies were blaming this economic crisis on schools. They were saying that there were not qualified job applicants for them to hire people, and the economy was failing because schools were failing. And one of the things that they talked about was this minimum competency approach that was common at the time, which was basically testing for a minimum threshold. And what a lot of people at that time wanted to do was shift towards a focus of a more rigorous curriculum. So testing the hard material rather than the bare minimum. But also at that time, it took about 2 decades to really get the ball rolling because the political gridlock was just so effective. So there was, the ESEA was reauthorized a decade after Nation at Risk, but you can see it was ineffective. Only 15 states had done the things that were supposed to be changed at that time, which were more rigorous standards and this state accountability system. So it isn't until No Child Left Behind in 2001 that everything changed, and that's when educational reform took this structure of using standardized testing as a feedback loop for school accountability. And so the No Child Left Behind, I put a summary there of what it requires states to do and highlighted the 2 having to do with standardized testing, which is administer annual achievement tests and participate in the NAEP, because that testing is what they use to validate state assessment systems. So immediately to No Child Left Behind, there was a very polarizing response to the testing requirements. There were some people who loved the idea of standardized testing, and then there were others that hated it. And on the left side here, I show what were the positive responses. The idea of having tons of data, being able to compare groupings of students, the idea that taking a test was an extra motivation to learn the material, and it created this competition between states, like a pressure to do better. And also, because all the data was available, it was transparent to students and everybody involved in the education system, so that they could have an idea of how their students were doing relative to their peers. Now, on the negative response side, you can see a lot of people were complaining about how this testing was causing extra stress for students and teachers, to the point where some teachers were quitting. There was a lot of controversy about how giving the tests that you lose test time because, not test time, but class time, because you're focusing only on the content that's tested, which meant that the emphasis on electives like music and art was just music and art, those types of things, they were just being ignored completely. Also because you have to give the test a little bit earlier to allow time for scoring before the end of a school year or the end of a semester, you also lose that school time for the coverage of the standards materials for the test. And then the last thing, the idea of having the teachers want the kids to do well on the test, so they're taking time to teach test-taking skills, which aren't specific standards and weren't the original purpose of the testing in the first place, but they're seeing the need to teach test-taking skills. And so you lose even more class time for teaching the content. Then the other negatives, more negatives still, were that just the foundational idea that standardized tests have to take certain formats like multiple choice, and that those types of questions don't model real life, and that fundamentally the whole thing just contradicts good educational practice. They also complained about bias on minorities, even though the original purpose of standardized testing was to be blind to the test takers. There's a ton of research out there that states that there's still a bias for minorities. And the last thing, really refuting the idea that this testing should be used as an accountability system. There was a research paper that talking specifically about the TVAS system in Tennessee is not being valid for teacher accountability. So definitely a lot of literature out there about the different, just completely polarized opinions on standardized testing. So what is the impact of standardized testing in Tennessee exactly? All the testing that's given are high stakes tests. The results have consequences for people in education, the students, the teachers, the schools, the districts. So for TN Ready and EOC scores from the TCAP, they represent for the students' grades somewhere between 0 and 15% of their grade, and that level is determined at the school board level. For ACT tests, the stakes are more for college admissions and scholarship funding. I have this cool data here for the ACT trend from 2011 to 2018 showing the steady increase for students, and I also put in there the threshold, the goal for the state, which is to get a score of 21 in 2020. What's really cool about this data is you can still see an increase in 2017, and 2017 is the year that they required all 11th graders to take the test. So in that data point, there's a bunch of students who wouldn't have normally taken the ACT, and the score is still increasing. In terms of teacher accountability, students' test scores, they impact this calculation for a teacher's level of effectiveness, or LOE, somewhere between 20% to 35% of that calculation. There's a range because there's multiple ways to calculate it, and they basically calculate all of those and then just take the best result. Now, when I asked teachers at my clinical assignment, I actually got discrepant answers about how that LOE actually affects their teacher compensation. It was a range from it does not play at all into teacher compensation to I think it affects it, but not by much. So it didn't seem like there was a lot of stress for at least the teachers that I talked to about the test scores. But I did find this interesting statistic on the TN.gov website that said that 74% of educators felt that Tennessee's teacher evaluation system assists them in making adjustments and improvements. This also I thought was really interesting. I found out from a teacher. I was talking to him about the arithmetic skills of his students and how I thought that they were doing fine learning the Algebra 1 material, but they had trouble with the arithmetic. And he said, well, you know, that's probably going to go away because they're taking away the calculator on the TN Ready tests at the younger levels. So that dependence on the calculator is kind of just going to gradually go away. And I thought that was a really interesting application of the standardized testing because now you have this feedback loop. So what's happening with results from high school students is affecting the way things are being taught and tested at the elementary school level. And that's probably something that was not possible in a previous system without this kind of data. And the last bullet I have here is about NAEP testing, which, like I said, was this national testing that has these results that don't really, you know, that in and of themselves don't have any stakes, but the federal government does look at them to validate the state assessment system. So when Tennessee started taking it in 2007, they did receive an F for alignment because Tennessee did not perform well on the test, but according to their state testing, they were getting high score. The students were getting high scores. But I did include this graph here on the bottom right, which is really cool. It's for grade 8 reading at the proficient and advanced level. And you can see starting from 2007 to 2015, again, the gradual increase of the students to the point where in 2015 we're actually, let me point out some of the things here. So this orange line is the average US line, and then the blue line is Tennessee. And you see in 2015, the Tennessee line actually crosses above the average in the US. So again, I just thought that was a really cool, cool data, and I got that from this tnscore.org website, which has other data for grade 4 and for math. It's an interesting read. So that's what I had in terms of material, and I just want to summarize and give a conclusion. So really, the use of standardized testing is only increasing. It's here and it's here to stay. We talked about the history of it really being motivated by educational reform and the idea that it became a main part of this accountability piece. And it was primed for it because of advances in technology, because there's computerized scoring and now even computerized administration. I did go over the different responses to it, both the positive and negative. And something to keep in mind is that the assessment system is really evolving over time, and it's changing the classroom. But, you know, the takeaway is that from the data, at least that I found, it does look like the students are responding and that the data is showing that they're thriving. And then one last thing that I wanted to leave with was just a bit of perspective, because I saw so much literature about the stress of test scores and how it was against educational practice. I wanted to show this picture that I found in one of the papers, and it's a heuristic teacher framework. So it's showing, you know, what characteristics of the teacher in the school, and then what the mediating factors are, and then how that, you know, moving to the right, how that contributes to student outcomes. And what I thought was interesting about this picture is how small the impact of test scores are in the whole scheme of student outcomes. And that's something I wanted to leave with because I think it's important to realize that the original purpose of the test scores was not to make students good at, the original importance of standardized testing is not to make students good at taking tests or even getting good test scores, but to actually improve their overall learning and their overall outcome. Okay, thank you.